They laughed at him every day in the town square. They called him worthless, slow, and invisible. He carried their burdens, fixed their broken things, and crossed the river before sunrise so their festival could shine at night, yet not a single person remembered his name. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, someone meant to stay in the shadows while others enjoyed the light. But on the biggest night of the year, when the entire town gathered in front of the glowing stage, something happened that no one was prepared for. The host unfolded the list of names, and the name they had mocked for years was spoken into the open air. Laughter died in people's throats. Whispers turned into silence. The boy they had called worthless was summoned to the stage of honor. What followed forced the entire town to face an uncomfortable truth. The man they ignored was the one who had quietly held everything together. In that single moment, pride turned into shame, mockery turned into reflection, and the word worthless lost its power forever. This is not just a story about success, it's a story about how the people you overlook today may be the ones carrying your world tomorrow. In the small riverside town of Kalimba, people believed they could measure a person's worth by the shine of their shoes and the confidence in their walk. Those who spoke loudly were heard, and those who moved quietly were often forgotten. Among the many faces that blended into the daily noise of the town was a young man named Sefyu Mbeki, whose presence was so subtle that even those who saw him every day barely remembered him by nightfall. He worked where others did not want to work, carried burdens no one noticed, and listened to jokes made at his expense without ever returning cruelty for cruelty. To many, he was invisible. To some, he was a convenient target for laughter. Sefyu's mornings began before the sun had fully risen. He crossed the old wooden bridge that connected the poorer quarter of Kalimba to the bustling market, his steps slow but steady, his mind already bracing for the looks and whispers that waited for him. Vendors who had known him since childhood greeted him with indifference at best, mockery at worst. They called him slow, useless, and unlucky, as if misfortune were a stain he carried on his skin. Sefyu accepted these words with a silence that others mistook for weakness, but inside him lived a quiet determination shaped by years of being underestimated. There had been a time when he believed the voices around him. As a boy, he had tried to speak up, to explain that he was more than the labels thrown at him, but the laughter that followed taught him to keep his thoughts folded inward. He learned to move through the world without demanding space, to make himself small so others would not feel threatened by his presence. Yet in the quiet moments when he was alone, when the river's slow current whispered against the rocks, he allowed himself to imagine a different future. In those private dreams, he was not invisible. He was seen, valued, and respected, not because of loud declarations, but because of the quiet strength he carried. The town was preparing for its annual cultural festival, an event that drew crowds from neighboring villages and brought with it music, dance, and the promise of recognition for those chosen to stand on the stage. For many, being called to perform or speak at the festival was a mark of honor, a public acknowledgement of talent and worth. Sefyu had never imagined his name would be associated with such a moment. The idea felt distant, almost unreal, like a story meant for someone else's life. Yet as banners were raised and rehearsals filled the evenings with noise and excitement, a subtle shift took place in Sefyu's world, though he did not yet realize it. While others practiced in groups, Sefyu continued his work in the background, helping to set up stalls, carrying heavy equipment, and fixing what was broken without being asked. Few thanked him, fewer still remembered his name. Yet one person noticed. A woman involved in organizing the festival observed the way Sefyu moved with quiet efficiency, how he solved problems without seeking praise, how he remained calm even when others grew frustrated. She watched him over several days, curiosity growing where indifference had once been. In his silence, she sensed a depth that the noise of the town had overlooked. As the festival drew closer, tensions rose. Performers argued over positions, organizers worried about schedules, and small mistakes became sources of loud blame. Through it all, Sefyu remained in the background, steady as the river he crossed each morning. When a piece of equipment failed, he fixed it. When someone forgot a detail, he filled the gap. Each small act went largely unnoticed, yet together they formed a quiet foundation upon which the festival preparations rested. The town, unaware of the support beneath its celebration, continued to overlook the one who held it together. On the eve of the festival, as the stage lights were tested and the final list of names was prepared, Sefyu stood at the edge of the crowd, watching others practice their lines and movements. He felt the familiar weight of being unseen, but he also felt something new stirring beneath it, a calm acceptance of who he was and what he carried within him. He did not know that the next day would bring a moment that would rewrite the way Kalimba saw him, and perhaps more importantly, the way he saw himself. The stage stood silent under the night sky, waiting. The names written on the list would soon be called, and when one of them was spoken aloud, the laughter of the town would falter, replaced by a stunned silence. For the boy no one noticed carried a truth that could not remain hidden forever, and the moment his name was announced would become a turning point no one in Kalimba would ever forget. The morning of the festival arrived with a restless energy that spread through Kalimba like wind before a storm. Colorful fabrics were draped across wooden stalls, musicians tested their instruments, and the smell of food drifted through the narrow streets. Laughter rose easily from groups who felt certain of their place in the celebration. Sefiu Mbeki moved through this lively chaos with the same quiet presence he always carried, adjusting ropes, lifting boxes, and guiding equipment into place. Though the town buzzed with excitement, his world felt familiar, shaped by the same routine of being needed for labor but rarely for acknowledgement. As he worked, fragments of conversation brushed against him. Some spoke of performers who would shine on the stage, others speculated about who might be chosen to speak during the ceremony of recognition. In these voices, Sefiu heard the unspoken truth that such moments were reserved for those the town already admired. When his name appeared in conversation, it was only as a point of comparison, a reminder of who would never be chosen. The words did not strike him with the same sharpness they once had, but they still carried weight, settling quietly in his chest like stones placed one by one. There had been a time when such words could unravel him completely. Memories of childhood surfaced as he tightened a knot in a rope, recalling how teachers had dismissed his potential and peers had laughed at his quiet nature. He had learned early that speaking too much invited ridicule, and that silence, though lonely, offered a small shield. Over the years, that silence had become part of his identity, shaping the way he moved through the world. Yet beneath it, a deeper voice had begun to form, one that whispered not of revenge or bitterness, but of patience and resilience. The festival organizers hurried across the grounds, checking lists and calling names, their voices sharp with urgency. One of them paused near Sefiu, momentarily distracted by a missing piece of equipment. Without waiting for instruction, he retrieved what was needed, setting it in place before the organizer could finish her complaint. She offered a brief nod, her thanks rushed and almost automatic, then moved on. Sefiu watched her go, aware that even small acknowledgements were fleeting, easily swallowed by the noise of busier concerns. Still, the quiet satisfaction of having helped lingered, a reminder that his actions held value even when unseen. As the sun climbed higher, the stage area grew crowded. Performers rehearsed their lines, some with nervous excitement, others with confident ease. Their voices filled the air, rising and falling in practiced rhythm. Sefiu lingered at the edge of the space, drawn by the hum of anticipation yet held back by the invisible line he had grown used to standing behind. He felt both part of the moment and separate from it, as though he were watching the town's heartbeat from just outside the chest. A group of young men passed by, their laughter loud and careless. One of them glanced at Sefiu and muttered a remark that drew a chorus of amusement from his friends. The word worthless slipped easily from their mouths, casual as a greeting. The sound of it echoed briefly in Sefiu's ears, but he did not respond. He had learned that reacting only fed the cruelty of those who needed to feel superior. Instead, he focused on the steady rhythm of his breath, grounding himself in the present, reminding himself that the opinions of others did not define the truth of his existence. Yet the truth was complicated. Though he had grown stronger in his silence, the desire to be seen had never left him. It lingered in the way he watched others take the stage, in the quiet ache he felt when applause filled the air for someone else's efforts. He did not envy their success, but he wondered what it would feel like to have his own efforts acknowledged openly. To hear his name spoken with respect rather than dismissal. These thoughts were quickly tucked away, familiar companions he had learned not to entertain for too long. Behind the scenes, the list of names was being finalized. The organizers gathered, voices lowered as they debated last-minute changes. The woman who had noticed Sefiu's quiet work stood among them, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the edge of the crowd where he moved unnoticed. She spoke up, her suggestion met with hesitation at first. Some questioned the idea, others dismissed it with a shake of the head, unable to imagine the town responding to someone so overlooked. Yet she persisted, her conviction rooted not in sympathy, but in observation. She had seen the foundation beneath the festival, and she believed the town deserved to see it too. As the afternoon approached and the crowd began to gather in earnest, Sefiu finished securing the final details of the setup. He wiped the dust from his hands, stepping back to take in the scene he had helped prepare. The stage stood ready, lights glinting softly, waiting to frame moments of celebration and recognition. Sefiu turned away, preparing to return to the background where he felt most comfortable, unaware that his name was now written on the list, poised to be spoken into the open air. The words that had once confined him would soon be challenged, not by confrontation, but by a moment of truth that would force the town to reconsider what it meant to call someone worthless. By the time evening crept over Kalimba, the festival grounds had transformed into a living tapestry of light and sound. Lanterns glowed above the crowd, reflecting in the river's slow-moving water, and the stage stood tall at the center of it all, framed by banners that fluttered gently in the warm air. The town gathered in numbers larger than anyone had expected, their voices blending into a restless hum of anticipation. Families settled onto benches, children darted between adults with laughter that rang like small bells, and performers waited behind the curtains, their expressions shifting between excitement and fear. It was a night meant to celebrate talent, tradition, and the people who shaped the town's identity, yet beneath the surface of festivity lay the unspoken hierarchy that had always defined who deserved to be seen. Sefiu Mbeki moved quietly along the edge of the gathering, helping where he could, carrying water to musicians, guiding elders to their seats, and adjusting lanterns that flickered too low. His presence remained subtle, as it always had, yet something in the air felt different to him, as though the night itself were holding its breath. The noise of the crowd washed over him, but his thoughts were unusually still. He felt neither hope nor dread, only a calm awareness of being part of something larger than his small, overlooked existence. It was a feeling he rarely allowed himself to name, but it filled him with a quiet steadiness as he completed his final task. Behind the stage, performers whispered among themselves, sharing last-minute encouragement and nervous jokes. Their voices rose and fell like the tide, carrying the familiar anxieties of those about to be seen. Sefiu paused nearby, listening without intruding, reminded of how foreign this world felt to him. The stage had always seemed like a place reserved for others, a space where confidence and recognition met under bright lights. He had never imagined standing there himself, and the thought passed through his mind now only as an abstract idea, quickly dismissed. Some paths, he believed, were simply not meant for him. The ceremony began with music that filled the open air, drawing cheers from the crowd. Dancers moved across the stage with practiced grace, their movements telling stories older than the town itself. Applause rose and fell in waves, and with each performance, the energy of the night grew. Sefiu watched from the shadows, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze steady. He felt no resentment toward those being celebrated, only a distant curiosity about what it must feel like to have one's efforts mirrored back by the admiration of others. As the performances continued, the woman who had spoken up for him earlier stood near the side of the stage, the folded list of names held close to her chest. Her eyes scanned the crowd, lingering occasionally on Sefiu's quiet figure at the edge. The weight of her decision pressed on her, not because she doubted its fairness, but because she knew how deeply the town clung to its assumptions. To call his name would not simply recognize his efforts, it would challenge the story the town told about itself, about who mattered and who did not. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the conviction that truth, once spoken, could open doors even pride had locked shut. The host stepped forward, his voice carrying easily over the crowd as he introduced the next part of the ceremony. This moment, he explained, was meant to honor those whose contributions often went unseen, the quiet forces that held the community together. Murmurs rippled through the audience, curiosity mixing with mild amusement. Some leaned forward with interest, others exchanged skeptical glances, already certain that the recognition would go to someone they expected, someone whose name was already spoken with respect. The idea that the town might be asked to reconsider its judgments felt distant to them, almost laughable. Sefiu felt the shift in the crowd's energy, though he did not yet understand its cause. He turned slightly toward the stage, drawn by the tone of the host's words. The mention of unseen contributions stirred something within him, a subtle resonance that felt both intimate and unfamiliar. He wondered briefly who might be honored, picturing faces of others who worked quietly in the background, people whose efforts he recognized because he shared their invisibility. The thought warmed him in a small way, a quiet acknowledgement that he was not alone in his unnoticed labor. The host unfolded the list, pausing in a way that stretched the moment thin. The crowd leaned in, the night air thick with anticipation. Sefiu's name rested among the inked lines, unremarkable on the page yet heavy with possibility. He stood unaware of the weight his name carried in that moment, his gaze still fixed on the stage with a gentle curiosity. The lantern light caught the edges of the paper as the host prepared to speak, and the silence that settled over the crowd felt deliberate, almost sacred. In that suspended breath before the name was announced, the town of Kalimba hovered at the edge of a change it did not yet understand. The laughter that had once dismissed Sefiu, the labels that had defined him, and the quiet resilience he had carried for so long were about to collide in a single spoken moment. The stage lights glowed brighter, the crowd's murmur faded into stillness, and the host opened his mouth to speak the name that would force everyone to look again at the boy they had called worthless. The host's voice cut through the quiet night, steady and clear as he read from the list. For a moment, the words felt like any other announcement, part of the familiar rhythm of ceremonies the town had heard for years. Then he spoke the name that no one had expected to hear in this place of light and applause. Sefyumbeki. The sound of it traveled across the open space, carried by the still air, and settled into the crowd with a weight that stunned the celebration into silence. For a heartbeat, no one reacted, as though the town itself needed time to recognize what it had just heard. Sefyu did not move at first. The name seemed to belong to someone else, an echo from a distant memory rather than a call meant for him. He glanced around searching the faces of those nearby expecting to see someone else step forward. But the eyes that turned toward him were uncertain, some wide with surprise, others narrowing in disbelief. The quiet that followed the announcement was not respectful silence but the heavy pause of a crowd recalibrating its assumptions. Whispers began to ripple outward, soft at first, then gaining strength as people tried to make sense of what they had heard. A few nervous laughs broke the stillness, quickly stifled by the tension in the air. Some thought it must be a mistake, a name misread or mispronounced. Others frowned, offended by the idea that someone they had dismissed for years could be called to the stage of honor. The unspoken hierarchy of Kalimba trembled under the weight of that single name, and the discomfort it stirred was visible in the shifting postures of the crowd. Sefyu felt the sudden heat of attention on his skin, unfamiliar and unsettling, as though the lanterns had turned to face him. The woman near the stage met his gaze, her expression calm and encouraging. She did not beckon him with grand gestures, but with a simple nod that carried quiet certainty. The host waited, his eyes scanning the crowd until they settled on Sefyu's still figure. The pause stretched long enough to feel deliberate, a silent invitation for him to step forward and claim the space his name had opened. Sefyu's heart beat harder against his ribs, the steady calm he had carried all evening giving way to a slow, rising tremor of disbelief. He took one hesitant step, then another, the ground beneath his feet feeling strangely unsteady. The path toward the stage seemed longer than it had ever been, each step drawing him out of the shadows he had grown accustomed to. As he moved, the whispers followed him, some tinged with skepticism, others with reluctant curiosity. Faces he recognized from years of passing by without acknowledgement now studied him openly, as if trying to reconcile the quiet labor they knew with the figure being called forward in a moment of honor. The climb onto the stage was small, just a few steps, yet it felt like crossing an invisible boundary. The lights were brighter up close, casting warm illumination over Sefyu's worn clothes and steady expression. He stood awkwardly at first, unsure where to place his hands, the weight of the crowd's attention pressing in from all sides. The host offered him a brief smile, not of pity, but of recognition, and began to speak of unseen contributions, of the quiet hands that held the community together when no one was watching. As the host described the ways Sefyu had supported the festival and the town over the years, murmurs of realization rippled through the audience. Small moments of memory surfaced in the minds of those who listened, flashes of times Sefyu had helped without being asked, had fixed what was broken without complaint, had carried burdens others had ignored. The words painted a picture that contrasted sharply with the labels the town had placed upon him, and the discomfort of that contrast settled heavily in the crowd. Some shifted uneasily, others lowered their eyes, confronted with the gap between who they thought Sefyu was and who he had quietly been all along. Sefyu listened to the words spoken about him with a strange mixture of humility and disbelief. He did not feel suddenly transformed into someone new, he felt only more visible, as though a curtain had been drawn back on a truth he had always lived. The applause that began, tentative at first, grew in strength, not from shared certainty, but from a collective recognition that something in the town's story had been incomplete. The sound washed over him, unfamiliar yet grounding, and for the first time, he allowed himself to stand without shrinking from the space he occupied. In that moment, under the glow of the stage lights, the word worthless lost its power over him. It did not vanish from the town's memory, but it was challenged by the living presence of a man who had carried worth quietly all along. The applause continued, and as Sefyu looked out over the faces of Kalimba, he saw not only surprise, but the beginning of reflection. The stage had done more than lift him into the light, it had held a mirror to the town, inviting it to see the unseen and to question the stories it had told about who mattered. The applause eventually softened, settling into a respectful quiet that felt heavier than noise. Sefyu remained on the stage, the warmth of the light still on his face, the echo of recognition lingering in his ears. For a moment, he felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before, as though the town could now see not only his actions but the years of silence he had carried inside him. He did not know what was expected of him, whether he should speak or simply accept the moment as it was. The host gestured gently, inviting him to share a few words, but Sephiu hesitated, the old instinct to remain quiet tugging at him from within. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, though soft, and the crowd leaned in to catch each word. He did not speak of bitterness or recount the cruelty he had endured. Instead, he spoke of work done quietly, of the dignity found in helping without being asked, and of the simple belief that every person, seen or unseen, carried a value that did not depend on applause. His words were not polished, but they carried a sincerity that filled the open space between the stage and the crowd. In his calm honesty, the town heard not an accusation, but an invitation to see differently. Faces in the audience shifted as his words settled. Some felt a flush of embarrassment, remembering the jokes they had made, the labels they had repeated without thought. Others felt a slow, uncomfortable recognition of how easily they had measured worth by visibility and confidence rather than by quiet contribution. The town of Kalimba, so used to celebrating those who stood at the center of attention, found itself confronted with the truth that its foundations rested on people it rarely named. The applause that followed Sephiu's words was softer than before, but deeper, carrying with it the weight of understanding rather than surprise. As Sephiu stepped down from the stage, the crowd parted in a way it never had for him before. The path he walked back into the lanternlit night felt different, not because the ground had changed, but because the eyes that followed him now carried recognition rather than dismissal. A few people spoke his name aloud as he passed, their voices tentative, as though testing a new habit. Others offered small nods or murmured thanks, gestures that, while simple, felt significant in a town where he had once moved unnoticed. The woman who had seen him earlier approached him near the edge of the festival grounds. She thanked him not only for his work, but for his presence, for the quiet consistency he had offered to the community. Sephiu met her gaze with a gentle smile, aware that her choice to speak his name had altered the course of his evening, and perhaps the way the town would see him from that day forward. Yet he also knew that one moment of recognition could not erase years of being overlooked. Change, he understood, would come slowly, through repeated acts of seeing and being seen. As the festival resumed its rhythm of music and laughter, Sephiu returned to the quiet spaces at the edge of the celebration, not out of habit, but out of choice. He felt no sudden urge to place himself at the center of attention. The stage had given him visibility, but it had not changed who he was. He was still the man who found meaning in small acts, who moved through the world with quiet steadiness. The difference now lay in how he carried himself. The word worthless, once heavy with the power to wound, felt distant, its hold loosened by the simple truth that worth did not need to be declared to exist. In the days that followed, Kalimba spoke of the moment when the name they had overlooked was called aloud on the stage. Some spoke of it as a lesson, others as an uncomfortable reminder of how easily they had misjudged someone they saw every day. For Sephiu, the moment became a quiet marker in his life, not of sudden transformation, but of alignment between who he had always been and how he was finally seen. The river still flowed as it always had, the bridge still carried him across each morning, and the town still buzzed with its familiar noise. Yet within that ordinary rhythm, something had shifted. A boy once called worthless walked with a steadier step, not because the town had finally spoken his name, but because he had learned, at last, to hear his own worth echo back from within.